So I like to give it a minute so that the audio is there. But hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the 2021 Virtual Compassion in Action Healthcare Conference. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan. Oh, there I am. I'm Director of Programs here at the Schwartz Center, and we're just thrilled that you've joined us today. We are so excited about the conversation that we're going to have with our first panel discussion, which is called Reckoning with Racism in Nursing, Story Sharing and Healing Through Telling, which I'm very excited about. Anyone who knows me, how committed I am to bringing narrative into healthcare spaces. So I'm very excited to welcome our presenters here today, who I will now introduce. Rayanne LeBlanc. Do you want to say hi, Rayanne?
Everyone.
Dr. Rayanne LeBlanc. Hi. Is the SeedWorks Endowed Associate Clinical Professor in Nursing at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we are so happy that you're here. You're going to be our moderator today. Is that right?
That's right.
Awesome. Okay. Next up, we have Sue Hagedorn. Hi, Sue.
Hello.
Dr. Sue Hagedorn, a documentary filmmaker and nurse activist. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And next up, we have Ngozi Opara, who's Director of Community Programs at Story Center, which I'm so excited to learn more about, and also a doctoral researcher at Loughborough University. Welcome, Ngozi.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. So thank you so much. I think that's it for me now. I'll come in at the end, but I will hand it over to you, Rayanne. Take it from here.
Great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you today in this space, and I just want to talk a little bit about our project here, Nurse Story, Reckoning with Racism in Nursing, Story Sharing and Healing Through Telling. We believe in the telling of stories, that it's an act of justice and agency to transform. And we will share a discussion about a project that created a safe online space to tell and share stories of systemic and interpersonal racism in nursing, stories about moments that we experienced, were confronted, resisted, or were complicit in racism. In the story sharing session, there were 5 workshops. Practices of compassion, self-care, contemplation, and active listening were facilitated in supporting this agency and collective healing to understand and respond to racism. We've been introduced, and this is our team. I just want to make a mention to Dr. Iradukunda Favorit, a very important part of our project, is unable to be with us today. We will be honoring her with our presentation and time with you. And so just we have no conflicts of interest. And these are our objectives that you can read. And this is sort of our outline for the day. I am Rayanne, the moderator, and I want to also thank Stephanie for facilitating this workshop. Melissa has been our coordinator in the background. Thank you, Melissa, and Clara for technical support. And of course, to the Schwartz Center and the audience today. I welcome you. I am holding in this space also the experience of Tuesday's keynote presentation by Dr. Oddish, and some of the points that Dr. Oddish made. And one is to trust in the alchemy of pain, that bearing witness is not enough, and that coming together to both tell and listen is essential. I also want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Camara Jones, who will be presenting her work later at this conference, who has informed me about storytelling and allegory as a form of addressing racism in medicine and public health. So this is a panelist discussion, and we'll also encourage your presentation at the end of our talks together. I thought we'd start with a pause, but I also wanted to share a story. Dr. Hagedorn is near the sea today, and I was earlier today interviewing a person, a nurse of color for another project we're working on. And he was sharing this intervention that he had created while working on the Jerry Psych unit. They were having a high level of use of restraints for people, and he wanted to change that practice. So he used an evidence-based project to implement an intersensory experience. So when he would get to know the person, and for example, this particular client had been a fisher person or fisherman. And so when that person was having a crisis, he brought them into this room, showed them a picture of the sea, had them listen to the sounds of the ocean, and had them smell what the sea smelled like. And this intervention changed the person, allowed them not to have to be chemically or physically restrained. So I just wanted to share that story with you. I also just want to offer a space to pause, just take one moment, maybe take a deep breath, hold it, and release. And just as we come together in this space, an honoring story and one another together. Now I'll talk a little bit about our theoretical model of enacted compassion. So we applied the Halifax, Roshi Joan Halifax, the model of enacted compassion and as a framework for this presentation and for our work as we move forward too. And according to this model, compassion is in general seen as having two main components: the affective feeling of caring in the minds of one's suffering, in the midst of one's suffering, and the motivation to relieve that suffering. It is the premise that compassion is dispositionally inactive. The interactions between one another, for example, the storyteller and listener, the healthcare provider and person in their care, and their context and environments. And in this process, that it is both contingent and emergent. So it happens in the moment. The attentional focus, cognitive thinking mind, somatic feeling mind body, and affective emotional states. These are emergent in the process of enacted compassion. So in our process of gathering stories in enacting compassion is a similar application of the GRACE model for use in clinical practice. And these are the 5 steps: gathering attention or grounding, recalling our intention, attuning to self and other, which is the pro-social affect, considering what will serve in the moment, and engaging with ethical enactment, and then ending. For example, attuning to self and others, step 3, describes the pro-social affect in the process of story sharing that reflects the GRACE model. The outcomes in the storytelling process: being heard, being seen, being known, and knowing oneself. They are outcomes of enacted compassion for the storyteller in the story sharing workshops. With racism and listening is a form of participation of enacted compassion in our application. So now I'd like to turn it over to my dear friend, colleague, and inspiration, Dr. Sue Hagedorn.
Rayanne, let's go back to the model. I can sort of talk about this with the model in front of us. Yeah. Okay, so hi there. I'm Sue Hagedorn. I'm on Block Island. I'm the one who can smell the sea. I don't feel that relaxed, but maybe I need to take a deep breath myself. So what is nurse story? Nurse story. It's not N-U-R-S-E, story, S-T-O-R-Y, but it's one noun, nurse story, that really combines both nursing, compassion, listening, with stories. And stories, for all of you in healthcare who work in teams, stories are sort of what we tell. We tell them in a certain way. We tell them in report. We do a case presentation. You know, JD was a 15-year-old male, Latino male with sore throat times 3 days, kind of thing. We tell that kind of story, or if we work on shifts, we share our story and report. Or when we're doing, 3 months, 6 months, whatever, reports with our colleagues to try to, apply the team method, we're always telling a certain kind of circumscribed story about a patient. We don't even usually include ourselves, frankly. We're talking about the patient, really objectifying that patient and then everybody sort of jumps in and gives their suggestions or whatever kind of report it is. But this is a different kind of storytelling that we're doing that includes the subjective along with the objective. It includes, in nursing, we have 4 or 5, depending on who's telling the story, ways of knowing. One is empirical. One is empirical, one is personal, one is aesthetic, and one is ethical. So we kind of, if we are really practicing the way we believe is best, we'll be combining most of those things together. So in a way, what Nurse Story is combining our ways of knowing and reflecting on an experience that happened to us, usually in the context of our compassionate practice. It comes from digital storytelling originally, but it's really a nurse or compassionate take on telling stories. It expands our narratives into a digital realm where we use images, music, art, our voice in recording the stories. And they're short little stories that people tell that usually go back to, that nurses tell, that go back to some moment, not kind of a big essay, but a moment where we felt a dilemma, usually an ethical or personal or a dilemma where there was some kind of conflict for us about what we were doing clinically. And so the stories serve us, like remembering this moment. And let's go back to that model, to that Joan Halifax model. You can see in that model, there is memory. We deal with that. Perspective taking a certain perspective in terms of telling a story about something that happened with us and a patient, oftentimes very early in our career, where we end up with insight about what happened. And it's a really, you know, and you can see the affective and the somatic and the cognitive and attentional sort of ways of knowing and being kind of all come together in this compassion wisdom. Lord knows how that happens. They're usually 3-day workshops, but it happens. It's really magic. Nurse Story. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the overdue. Do I still have time, Rayanne? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk about the workshops that we're discussing today, which have 2 variations on them. There was, you know, we know that George Floyd got murdered a year ago. Of course, we know about a lot of other racist, violent actions that have been going on for years, and they've kind of become, we're more aware of them now, and maybe they're increasing now. And so all of us who are in this so-called room have been affected by this this awakening that we're in right now. And so what overdue reckoning refers to is kind of, this is a time when in nursing we need to reckon with, and it's overdue, the role of racism and how it affects nurses. So this started out with a few nurses last summer, and they started in the fall facilitating these workshops that were opportunities for, mostly for nurses of color to share their stories, and for the rest of us to practice our listening skills. And they happened over 5 weeks, and they were incredible. They started out kind of, okay, interesting, and they got more and more passionate as we got towards 5 weeks in. And in Nurse Story, we decided, hey, why don't we sort of add to that and do a Nurse Story workshop a few days after the sort of more sort of the sharing of the stories. And so we did both of them. We ran a storytelling workshop a couple of days after each one of the sessions of Overdue. And a bunch of stories were developed, and Gassi will tell us about them. I think we're going to see one. And then it moved on to something that continues to be interesting that Rayanne was referring to when she was talking about the interview that she did earlier today, where a group of us who were involved in Overdue Reckoning came together to gather stories from individual nurses of color. We're up to close to 50 now, and we're going to put them together in a format that will be a teaching tool and a learning tool and a change tool in nursing, where we really listen to these stories. We'll condense the stories into smaller, more effective pieces, and then we will share them with other people. It's going to be really powerful. And there's a group of 6 of us who come together, and we are cross-cultural, and we've had to sort of deal with the issues of power and race and class and what we do in nursing. We have a hierarchy, and you know, we've been attending to our process while we've been developing this methodology and this action of pulling together stories. How do we show compassion? You know, can you imagine? You know, I think that what happened speaking for myself, about by the 3rd session of the Overdue Reckoning, where it started, I know many other individuals. I would be amazed if anybody came out of those groups and hearing these stories without having the experience of being side by side with that person telling a story and experiencing that pain and suffering that person experienced by being of color and being a nurse. It was just, there was no way not to be inside that person's skin and feeling that discomfort and anger and sadness, and, you know, etc. So I think I'm going to end there in describing our project.
So, Sue, I wonder if you had any thoughts about any of the ethical considerations about this process and how we accounted for ethical considerations.
Oh, absolutely. Let me see. All right, here's the take-home message, that facilitating the story that the individual storyteller wants to be told. Imagine the ethics that come up of being with someone who's telling a story of one of their most vulnerable moments. And for any of you who are listening, who are nurses, and frankly, for any of the rest of you health providers, you all know how we compare ourselves to other people and how afraid we are of not being really good and not being really strong. You know, we have that kind of expectation of being super people. And then you're telling a story about vulnerability. Well, this thing happened to me. I was in this moment, and she said to me, and instead of talking back to her, I just was silenced. I just was quiet. I felt such pain. I didn't know what, you know, etc. kind of thing. So let's say a storyteller is telling that story, and we're recording her story and or helping her kind of pull it all together into a short little 3-minute movie, which is a nurse story. We have to be totally respectful. And I heard the word in here, honor. as if it was almost a spiritual and a religious, any which way you can't make that word honor any bigger. We're honoring the intention of the person telling her or his story. It's not our story to tell. I might want to change that story. Well, let me just take out a few of those words here. Really, it's more powerful. That's not such a good story. Let's tell that other story, because that, is, you just said it better and it's a shorter story. That is not something that, as someone gathering stories, really has we don't have the right to do that. It's sort of like being a therapist, and I don't mean this as therapy, but you really have to be listening what the storyteller is saying, and it's our job to help her or him tell the story in the most meaningful, concise way that serves her or him, and also communicates, which I think is probably secondary, how other people get it, but it's really important how the storyteller experiences being heard, being heard, being seen, being known. We're back to this, as outcomes, and knowing what their story is. So that's really the most important thing about ethics and being sort of a story facilitator. These are not our stories. And I can give you an example of something that's happened recently that kind of pushed some of our buttons, and it's really resulted in something very positive, where one of our colleagues, it was in the most recent collection of all these almost 50 stories about experiences of being a nurse of color, and they're oftentimes painful, really affecting stories. And one of our colleagues got so excited about what a fantastic story. She shared it with a funder. She said, "Oh, I've just got to tell you, this is the greatest thing. I want to share the story with you." And then she shared this story with this funder. And without having any consent from anyone. And then she went back and then she said, "Is it okay if I share the story?" And of course, the person who she was listening to the story from said, "Oh, of course. Oh, I'm glad that you liked my story." But you can also think about that. Like, what is the ethics of obtaining consent in a situation like that? It's not really informed consent, where you think, well, oh my goodness, what if my boss hears that story? That my boss will recognize that as me, and I could lose my job, or, oh, I should have said something at the time instead of, it feels like I'm talking behind my supervisor's back, or, on and on. And then anyway, to make a long story short, it went even further than that. And it was kind of, it reminded us of all the ethics. We're in this project. One of the stages of collecting the stories is listening to the story, recording the story on Zoom, having it transcribed, analyzing the story, sort of highlighting what we think as an interviewer was most important. And then in terms of ethics, I think one of the most important things is then sharing that information with the person who told the story, the informant in the first place. Did I hear that right? Did I interpret that right? Is there something in the story that makes you feel too vulnerable? If it comes back to you, and you please take that out, because we don't want to put you at risk. And then we can get some consent maybe at that point. But it's a very, we're talking about vulnerability, and we're protecting in so many ways, vulnerability. of the people whose stories that we're hearing. So I could go on with more ethics, but I think that that kind of gives you a feel of what we're really have to be super careful. And let me just throw in one other thing, working across cultures and races. It's like the ethics, you know, and believe me, I don't feel like I'm an authority on this at all. You know, I'm just like everybody else, kind of like tiptoeing in there and living it. But there's a real ethic of not taking control and not, you know, the whole dominant, you know, being dominant is really an ethical issue too. And something that when we're working in a group, making decisions together, interpreting stories, the ethics of being multiracial and class and culture and gender is really important, and power.
Thank you, Sue. And I want to just kind of summarize the importance of telling the story a person wants to tell, positive story, joy, suffering, the story the person wants to tell, as well, and honoring all those expressions, and the multiple levels of consent that are necessary when we begin to share, especially other people's stories. So thank you. And I'm really pleased now to again, Dr. Iradukunda could not be with us today. And thank you, Sue, for talking about ethical issues. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ngozi Opara, social justice artist. And take it away, Ngozi.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so my questions are, what do I think are the most important outcomes of this storytelling project? This actually kind of ties back into what Sue was just saying. One of the ethical considerations that was on the forefront of my mind is the history of stories of people of color being used to educate non-people of color or white people. And so one of the things we really wanted to do when like forming the creation of this process is to make sure there was a safe space for people of color only to talk amongst themselves, not feel like their story was going to be, you know, sent away or, you know, turned into something else. And so I think one of the most important outcomes for those POC only groups, but also all the storytellers that joined, was just having space to talk freely. I think specifically coming into a space with nurses, and I'm not a nurse at all, but I just felt the energy of people coming in and just wanting to caretake for others and wanting to listen. And there was just so much empathy in the room. But it was nice to kind of do this role reversal and ask people to kind of lean into themselves and ask themselves, and also take care of themselves. And part of that taking care was not only, you know, getting affirmation, but creating a space of vulnerability. So I think one of the most important outcomes was creating a safe space where people could talk about these things that they aren't allowed to talk to, or maybe are afraid of talking about at work, or maybe they don't want to center themselves. I got a lot of those participants were being like, oh, I don't want to take up too much space. There was just so much care and love in the room. But I was like, actually, I think it's okay. And I think we should create those spaces for you to be the focus of your own story. And there's many ways to be impacted by racism. It's not just for people of color. And so we got, just like you were saying, Ryan, there were a lot of stories about pain and suffering, but there were also a lot of stories about resilience and joy and just having questions and being in a place where they're like, I don't know was the last line of their sentence, and just having space to say that was really, really impactful. And our work in Story Center, we always kind of talk about it in two ways, like the process versus the product. And so the process of kind of leaning into your own story and being around people who are also leaning into their own stories creates this atmosphere of vulnerability, which is really impactful. But then also what they created were these stories that could then be, you know, if they consented, sent out into the world. And these stories are based and grounded in this idea of personal insight, personal vulnerability, emotional honesty, emotional complexity. And so someone maybe who's never been a nurse or never met this person can still read the story or watch the story and feel the human and that human conflict. And actually it's like a way to experience the world without having to experience that world. And so it's like free learning. It's like you get a free lesson because you're kind of living through this person's life. And so I think that's another important outcome. They did all this work in process together, but then they sent it out into the world, and it's like that work was kind of given. They just handed the baton off so someone could kind of get to where they are now, or, you know, start that process much easier than they had to. So I think that was one of the other important outcomes of the workshop. And then how does the process of storytelling enact compassion? I think in a myriad of ways, kind of what we were all talking about at the beginning with the model. But one of the ones I think is usually sold or talked about is what we ask folks to do in these storytelling circles is to lean back in their chairs and start sorting through their own histories, and to go in and start picking these memories that feel, relevant. And so what we're actually asking people to do is to be compassionate to themselves first, to like notice these things that happened, across time, and start to make meaning of it. And that process of actually seeing yourself as separate, but also the same as your current self, actually allows you to embody compassion for who you used to be. Maybe you're still that person, but maybe you're not. And I think that process subliminally then can extend to other people. And so if everyone is doing that in the group, which is what happens, everyone's kind of sorting through their archives of who they are and who they have been, they're generating this empathy for who they were and who they are becoming. And so also they're in that space of other people generating that empathy for who they are and who they are becoming. And so I think as cliche as it sounds, I think it's cliche because there's truth in it. This idea of starting with self-compassion does so much work. And so this idea of seeing yourself and being able to forgive yourself, or being able to name when you made a mistake, being able to say, I don't know, being able to say I was strong when I shouldn't have been, all these things that showed up in our workshop actually allowed people to have a lot of compassion for themselves. And then when they heard someone else's story, they almost had primed themselves to be able to hear their story and oh, maybe they have something similar. Maybe they were going through something. Maybe this self that they're talking about is not the self that they still are, or any version of that. So I think this idea of seeing yourself in this really, really intense way. We're talking about how lovely these workshops are. They're really hard, powerful workshops. They're hard because we're asking folks to do a lot of truth saying to themselves and then to a group of like virtual strangers. And yeah, I think the second part of this compassion is, again, the stories that we told, or when we ask folks to tell stories, we do tell them to focus on a moment, like Sue was saying, focus on these specific scenes and instances. And so and there's so much research for years and years to talk about, like when you want to talk about an issue, try and humanize it, put it in a story. And so we're asking these people to tell these stories, and then these issues, like the word racism, the word systemic oppression, this means a million things to a million people. These concepts are so high and heavy that they almost cease to have meaning. But when you take the word racism and you funnel it down into being about a person on a day, in a moment, and this is how it felt, and this is what I learned, you can actually see racism in a very different way. You actually can feel it. It becomes embodied, it becomes human. And so I think in that way, compassion becomes almost like you don't even get to say, I'm going to be compassionate. It just happens. You start to relate to the body of the person in the story. You start to relate to those kinds of thoughts, that kind of doubt, that kind of success, that kind of power, that kind of weakness, etc.
Thank you, Ngozi. And so I think with that, I think it's time to share one of the stories that came out of the workshop. And I'll just say that this, there we go. And this is shared with permission for this particular conference by a nurse from the Nurse Family Partnership, Dashe Lawton, a really amazing human being. And here we go.
I'm used to leading our NFPT meetings. I'm usually the one talking, whether I'm delivering information about an update to a policy, asking for ideas on how to fix a procedure, or facilitating a conversation about our nursing practice. I'm used to leading the team, but I'm not used to exposing my vulnerabilities. Not in this way. We just don't talk about this, or at least I haven't shared my perspective. But the time had come to have this discussion. There is such a high chance that one of our moms will want to talk about this during one of their visits. The National Service Office is talking about this now. It's time that we finally bring this up. I didn't feel ready. My stomach was in knots. My mouth was dry, but I jumped in. I opened with, "Does anyone not know who George Floyd is?" I was finally talking about race with my team from my perspective. I didn't want to speak for all Black people, but it was time to bring up what's happening in our country, because an NFP mom could bring it up or be desperate to want to share her feelings and be heard. I'm scared. When I see a headline about another Black man being killed, I first look for where it took place because I have family all over the country. Then I look for the name if it has been released. Was it someone I know? Was it my father? My brother? One of my cousins in college? I was terrified to bring up how scared I am to my all-white NFP team. Will they understand? Will they minimize my fear? Will they say all lives matter when I'm desperate to say Black lives shouldn't matter any less than anyone else's life? I work in a rural county in the South. I am in my 30s, liberal, I wear my hair naturally. I am the only Black supervisor in the health department. I constantly wonder if I will be taken seriously. As much as I try to hide, I know people see me. I'm hard to miss. But during this team meeting, I finally shared my thoughts and feelings about race with my team. I stopped hiding from how uncomfortable it is to have this conversation as the only person of color in the room. But as I shared, my team nodded in acknowledgement. And after I was finished, I even got a wow and a conversation about where do we go from here. I felt heard. Today, my voice mattered.
So we welcome any responses to that story in the chat if you'd like to share a response. And I'll just say a few words about the production of these stories. These were called single image digital stories. So that simplifies the process a little bit. So the person telling the story selects the image they want to use, and the other features are added to that. So do feel free to share your responses in the chat to that particular story if you had anything that came up for you that you want to share. Except that I think the chat can only be seen by the panelists. That might be a function that's in place. I think that is true. Thank you. I wondered if Ngazi or Sue wanted to share anything about that story, that process.
I can share a bit. One of the things I'll say to folks is just after, I know for me, every time I hear that story, my chest gets warm. So I just want to ask folks to just notice their bodies as they're listening to that. I think there are a lot of words, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, work that can be triggering to us. So just noticing how you feel and taking care of yourself. And I also want to remind folks that one of the things that we say at Story Center is that these stories are not supposed to be everyone's stories. In fact, the opposite. This is this one person's story. So I think it's fine for you to find, relationship to it and say, oh, that's what happened to me too, or have the exact opposite experience. That's one of the reasons Story Center works the way we do, where we want to meet everyone, because the more stories we have, the more diverse and nuanced those narratives can be. But yeah, thank you, Rand, for sharing that.
Thank you.
I mean, you just felt her pain and her sense of, I gotta say this, I gotta say it. I heard that story more deeply. I mean, that's the interesting thing about these stories. We've gathered them together. We have hundreds of stories now that can be used by different people as they want to, that are on our website, and they can be taught, they can be used in teaching, they can be used in, reflective practice, they can be used a lot of different ways, because you feel this experience, and I heard, and because you can see it more than, and hear it more than once. I mean, I've heard this story and seen this story, I don't know, 10 times, 5 times. And this time I felt I honored the story. I felt that this was the most important thing I've ever heard. The way she told it, she didn't use too many words. She just put it out there and said, there you go. And
So I'll just,
yeah.
thanks. I just want to read some of the chatted comments. I'm so excited to read them. Biba says, powerful story. Her courage to share stood out to me. Agree, as a person of color, it feels like what I do all the time when I listen to the news every day. And I hope I'm pronouncing people's names correctly. Sapna, I was impressed by her sense of loneliness at her work. So thank you for sharing those responses. Let's move on to the next aspect here. Whoops. What? Okay, so we're going to invite you now to be a participant. Just going to take actually 5 minutes because of the time. And if you feel so moved, and this can happen in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you can write a story. And the prompt that we're sharing, the prompt that we used in the workshops, tell a story about a time you moved from witnessing racism to acting to address it. What did it feel like? So we're centering here in your feelings. If you could take just 5 minutes, we invite you to actually take pen or pencil to paper, if you choose, and just to write for 5 minutes to this prompt. So we'll be quiet, or maybe you don't feel moved to write to this prompt, but would like to write to something else for 5 minutes. I just really encourage this instrument of pen to paper in the process versus a computer. So I got mine. Maybe you have one nearby. Hope you can find it if you do. And we'll write for 5 minutes. Oh, and just one more comment by Jill. It was a powerful story. Her vulnerability came through. I felt the fear in her voice. Yes. All right, we'll start writing. So that's 5 minutes. It can go by fast or slow depending on how that experience felt. So this is just telling a story for yourself. Often in our workshops, we're telling a story for ourselves, but we're sharing it too. That's part of the process of community. And so just gonna go back now to the GRACE model and think about this from the perspective of how we receive story to ourselves, how we share it with ourselves, how we tell the story to ourselves, and kind of this model can be used in this process. And as we are, of course, learning more about ourselves in every story we tell, being heard by ourselves, being seen by ourselves, being known, and again, knowing oneself. And as we move toward the, the end of this presentation, we had just a little exercise about witnessing self-compassion and acting self-compassion. And often we would ask people to share out their story, but when we were talking about preparing for this presentation, Ngozi reminded me that it's pretty, we need to have a lot of space and time when we're sharing stories with each other to hold them fully. And I wondered if Ngozi, you'd like to lead us in this last process with the story we might have created, hopefully, if we did on paper.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things, just like Rayanne was saying, because there's not enough space, enough time to hold all of your stories, we don't want to just offer it up. Because one of the things that we've noticed in doing this workshop, but just in doing our work in general, is that when you start to tell a story, maybe things bubble up, 4.5 minutes in, and then you finally have the story drip out. Or maybe it comes because you've been telling the story for years and years and years, and it's on the tip of your tongue. And either way, we want you to try and acknowledge that to yourself. And so if you did do something on a piece of paper, one of the reasons Rayanne was asking that we did it is just because if you have it on a piece of paper, you can kind of hold it up like an object. So that's one of the healing parts of storytelling, is you actually objectify your experience. And research shows that when you do that, you can actually better see yourself because you can actually interact with it versus interacting with yourself. And so we want you to actually try to hold it and treat it like an object here, your story and yourself of that story. And so maybe that means after this workshop, you take it and you fold it into a beautiful origami bird and you place it, on your mantle to wake you up in the morning. Or maybe that means you rip it up. Maybe that means something in between. But we want you to really hold your story and treat it. And maybe it takes time to know how you want to treat this object, but we want you to think about how you want to hold that story, or how you want to let go of that story, or if you want to let go of that story. Another way to treat your object is to share it. So if you do feel comfortable, we ask that you try and find someone to hold that space with you. Maybe you can share your story by reading it to them or offering that object as a letter, maybe. But yeah, these are just some options for how to take care of your stories and take care of yourself as storytellers.
Thank you, Ngozi. And so these, we've shared with you today some of the ways we've used the model of enacted compassion, the processes of how stories are told, and some of the ways we have story circles, story sharing, and some of the elements of that process that were part of our project in this that we shared with you today. And so we do have, if you want more information about Reckoning with Racism storytelling processes, this is our team. We welcome you to reach out to us. And we're very open now for question and answer for the, the next 5 minutes. If anybody has a question, I believe you entered into the chat, or the question and answer section, sorry. And we're happy to take your questions.
Hi, is it okay if I rejoin you, Rayanne?
Sure, absolutely.
In this part of the session. Thank you. First of all, I just want to express my profound gratitude for the important work that you're doing, and the way that you've articulated sort of how fundamentally connecting it is to listen to each other's experiences, to make space for each other's stories, whether they are similar to our own, whether they're worlds away from our own. I'm looking at the attendee list here, and I know we have so many of our Schwartz rounds leaders on the call here today. And as you might know, so much of what we do at the Schwartz Center, and have done for 26 years now, is hold space within our healthcare organizations for interprofessional storytelling, story sharing, community building, perspective taking, all of the things in Roshi Jones' beautiful little graphic. And so one of the questions I had, and I'll throw it out to any of you, is I guess one of the things that strikes me about your work is that you create this space for intra-professional story sharing, storytelling. And I wonder if any of you want to speak to what you feel the benefits are, or how the experience might be different when you're sharing experiences that might still be very different. And nursing is a very diverse profession on every level. But what is it like for people to share their stories and their experiences with others who share their professional training, orientation, et cetera?
Oh, Sue, you're on mute. I think, Sue, you're talking.
Yes, now I'm not. One of the things, and I bet you there are other professions like this, is there is almost a special language that we nurses speak. It's amazing wherever you are. I mean, this is, I'm sure, not universal, but I'm surprised when we don't connect when we meet other nurses. There is something that we're very quick to make connections with each other. And then in this kind of situation where we're sharing our stories, I mean, it's sort of a joke I think in Story Center, and in the storytelling process, you start out with a story circle. And in nursing, that story circle, no more than 10 people in that story circle, it could go on all day. Sure. One person tells their story, it's like, oh my God, let me tell, oh yes, I had, and it goes, there's such a connection,
that shared
between nurses.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's something that can be really powerful, especially in nursing, where you see. I had a nursing leader once tell me that she had nurses from 5 different generations working together on a single unit in her hospital. And when you have people who have such different lived experience who are working together to provide collaborative, we hope, compassionate care to their patients, having that shared language and finding ways to connect through that shared language can be so important. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to recognize also there was something that you said, Ngozi, that I just loved. I know it'll stay with me. You know, when you hear a fragment of language and you're like, oh, this one's going to stick. I loved what you said about how stories allow us to sort through the archives of who we are and who we've been. And I really appreciate the value that you attributed as well to the externalizing process, to taking one of our experiences that lives within us, taking that outside of us and sharing it with others. And the way, I have to say, and the way in which I think that's part of what we do in Schwartz rounds in my other life as part of the narrative medicine faculty at Columbia, that's something we talk a lot about. When we externalize our stories, we have a chance to hold them up as objects and look, and I love the idea of doing it as origami too. I'm
Right.
more about that. But we have a chance to look at how other people see them and also to examine them anew ourselves. I wonder if you have anything else you want us to add to that.
No, that's really exciting. That's one of the things I'm researching in my current PhD, is because I've just felt it so long. So it's nice to finally have language. And that's one of the things that we like to teach at Story Center, that it feels good, and it's often compared to therapy because it is good to do this, to kind of exit it from ourselves, objectify it, and see it as part of us, but also a part of us that can be disposable, or, you know, you can add pretty things and pretty features onto it, but that we are flexible inherently too. So our stories are part of us, but not us. And so that's I think a really good picture of that.
Oh, awesome.
You know, we're under times. I mean, I know time is a pressure always, and I just wanted to really honor Jill's Jill made a full comment about Dashe's story, and and Ngozi reminded me that I didn't read the whole thing. So I want to also acknowledge how time pressure interferes with our reflective practice, and I want to apologize for that. So I'm going to read that comment that Jill offered. Jill said, "It was a powerful story. Her vulnerability came through. I felt the fear in her voice when she shared her worry that her family member, someone she knows, could be a victim of violence." I just want to really honor that comment. So on all of them.
Thanks, Ryan. And there's a comment in the Q&A I just want to acknowledge before we move on to closing the session. And Rose, we're really grateful for it. And I know how hard it was to engage in this forum. We understood it to be a panel and set it up as such, but I think in retrospect, we would have done this as sort of a Zoom meeting, so we all could have seen each other and held that space for sharing our responses to this really important work. So Rose, if you wouldn't mind, if I share your comments, I'm assuming since you put it on the open forum, it's okay, that you just say thank you for the opportunity to listen and write down your own story as a witness. It brought tears to my eyes and elicited a very visceral response. And I think that speaks to the way in which we've talked of this work as magical and lovely, and also really, really hard. I am a white nurse who witnessed a patient verbally assaulting a coworker. I never heard the word boy directed at a compassionate and loving African-American caregiver in such a threatening way. I had no choice but to speak up. And as I wrote it today, it made me realize how important these conversations are. Thank you for sharing that. Do any of our panelists want to comment?
Well, I want to say thank you, Rose, for sharing that. Yeah, very much so. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess with that, we're going to bring things to an end today. I feel like, to your point, we could go on forever, Sue, talking about this and how important it is to engage with stories and the work that we all do together to bring compassion into our workplaces, into our healthcare experiences. So I just want to thank you again. We're so thrilled that you've joined us here today. We're really grateful to you, our panelists, and also to our participants today. We had a fantastic turnout. We're so glad you're all here. And we're just getting started. As you know, we'll be continuing these sessions bi-weekly through September. you will figure this out soon enough, but we will be sending you weekly recaps every Monday so that you can sort of ground yourself in what you experienced the week prior and also look forward to what's coming up ahead. It will also contain a post-test for those of you who are going for CME and CEU, so keep an eye out for that. I also want to just thank our national business members of the Schwartz Center who make all the work that we do possible and allow us to hold this beautiful community for all of you and for us as well. This conference would absolutely not be possible without them. So we're going to change the tone of things next week with our Tuesday session. It will also be incredibly valuable in terms of how we can bring compassion into our healthcare organizations. And we're going to hear from some phenomenal speakers who will be offering an interactive workshop on a pro-social staff leadership model based on courage and compassion. So a little different, equally important work, and we hope we'll see you all there. Thank you, and thanks to our panelists. Take care, everyone.